Welcome everyone to my channel, The Grim Reader, Kathy Grimm, and today it's all about the Grimms. So I am sort of about a third of the way into my biography of the Grimms. I took the cover off. Oh, it's right here. It's German, the Brothers Grimm, Die Brüder Grimm, and is written by this professor who's a professor at Humboldt in Berlin, the Humboldt University, German literary scholar. It says here on his wiki page, Stefan Martus, bit younger than me, not much, and he studied German philology, which we'll talk about later on. What is philology? Social studies, philosophy, and sociology at, it says Ratisbon. I'm sorry, I have to click on this because it's Regensburg. I don't know. That's the name of. Why do they call it Ratisbon? Sorry, so I've been getting sidetracked already. The University of Regensburg in upper Franconia part of Bavaria. It's a good biography of the Grimms, and it's sort of interesting for me to be reading a fully fledged one from beginning to the end, because as I said previously, I kind of knew about them mainly through working with the fairy tales for many years now, teaching them, not really doing research, except in order to be able to teach them in an adequately correct way, or contextualizing way. And in the class, we do read a chapter of a book by Jack Zipes, the American fairy tale scholar, who's written a lot of stuff on the Grimms and other people. And that one kind of is interesting because what he does is he sets it up as once there were two brothers called Grimm, so once upon a time. So it's a sort of like a fairy tale story, because in a certain way it does have, the reason why it's sort of fairy tale-esque, I guess, is because the fairy tales became such a big deal, they're so sort of well known, even at the level of themselves being not really conceived always as real people. As I said, I think if you were to go and do a sort of survey somewhere in a city, what do you know about the Brothers Grimm? People would just say fairy tales, and they might mention a few of them, and they may even mention fairy tales that are not actually connected to the Brothers Grimm. Like, you know, they might get confused. But they would probably know Little Red Riding Hood, I'm assuming, Cinderella, Snow White, Hansel and Gretel. So, you know, some of the big ones, most people would, I think, associate that with the Grimms. Not everyone, but a lot of people, and even in America, or, you know. And so that's how and why did they become so famous? And who were they really is the question. Because that's the other thing. I did this as a sort of test with my husband, who's, you know, fairly well-educated person and well-read. And I asked him, what do you know about the Grimms? But he doesn't really read fairy tales or anything. So I asked him, what do you know about the Grimms? And he said, so what he knew is he did know, because from his studies of English, that they were connected to linguistic stuff, like language studies too. But then I asked, well, which one of them was? And he didn't know that. That's interesting. I thought that was kind of surprising that he didn't know that Jacob Grimm was the sort of more scientific of the two. Wilhelm was more the more the writer, I guess. But they both did research too. But Jacob just had a wider range, I guess, in terms of his research, because he did this linguistic stuff as well later on. I haven't really got to that part of the biography yet. I'll come back and give another. But this is sort of the introduction to who they were. And also he couldn't really tell me exactly when he said 19th century. He didn't know when they were born or anything. I asked him, well, do you know when they were born? And stuff like that, basic stuff about when were they born. And sorry, I'm peering over it. I did make a couple of notes here. And also I said, well, where were they from? And he said Germany. And of course, you know, the German professor looked at him and said, no, there was no Germany when they were around. I mean, there was actually, I think one of them, I don't even know if they were still around when Germany actually happened. I have to check when they passed away. But as most people who study history know, Germany as an entity that's not Prussia or a bunch of little states, duchies, as they call them, duchies, and other kind of little state-like entities that didn't happen until 1870 at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, and we basically have Bismarck to thank for really pushing it through. And it took a lot of pushing for many, many decades there. The whole post, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, after the Napoleonic stuff, that's when Germany comes into being. And of course, even before then, there was sort of people were becoming aware of a German identity. But what's interesting is, and this is kind of part of their story, is that they were part of the German identity, or the creation of it, because of their texts and the fairy tales. They helped cement this idea of an actual German self, for better or for worse, I guess. And of course, I am sort of foreshadowing, the Nazis did come along and kind of like honed in on the fact that there was some anti-Semitism in their tales, and they are kind of interested in the construction of Germanness. And of course, they were easily co-opted for the Nazis, but they're different, and for many different reasons. And it's hard to explain what's so unique about them. And so the question I have right now is, well, is it because of their uniqueness that they became so famous? And I think perhaps in the German context, it is. They were sort of their own thing. For one thing, there were always two of them. They're kind of like the Brothers Grimm. People may not even know their first names. One of them is Wilhelm, one of them is Jacob. And so even that's a little unusual and interesting, and perhaps part of the lore, I guess. But when I do it with the students, they're always so surprised to figure out, wow, these were actually kind of active, scholarly men who worked extremely hard from the get-go, from the time they were in school, to do what they wanted to do, which is basically research and collect texts and write and be scholars, and then later on work on a dictionary. And they just spent immense amounts of time working. So they're extremely hardworking, and they were also extremely smart. And part of what happens in the biography is the big event, the big spoilery event, is when Jacob is 11 and Wilhelm is 10. Their father, who had been sort of, I would describe him as a fairly big fish in a small pond. He was a civil servant, a higher level civil servant in a fairly small town in the part of Hessen that's to the north of Frankfurt. So not sort of middle to north Hessen. Hessen is the state in the middle that most of you perhaps just know from history in terms of the mercenary soldiers. That one of the leaders, Wilhelm the Ninth, I think, who was around when they were around, did this. He sent soldiers over to fight for money, to get money. It's a way to get money. And so the dates are, let me show you, so they were born, Jacob was born on the 4th of January in 1785, and then Wilhelm, the younger one, was born on the 24th of 1786. And another sort of thing that the students find interesting is that they did have 3 other brothers and 1 sister. Who was the youngest. And then there were other children that had died young, as was fairly normal back in the day. But there were 3 other brothers. Ludwig Emil was a pretty famous artist, and there's lots of pictures of them from painted or illustrations made by him, pencil, I think, or some kind of crayon. Not many paintings. And then the other 2 are the sort of lesser Grimms, and there are books about them. I'm kind of intrigued by Ferdinand Grimm, and then I think the other one was Karl Grimm, and they were all younger than Jacob and Wilhelm. And one thing that does happen after the father passes away is they're in this very precarious financial situation. It really is the breadwinner dies and then leaves the mother with however many kids, 6 kids, and there is a definite fall from the sort of comfortable. I think it's kind of important to sort of pinpoint their class background, because they're sort of fairly well off, so fairly high up in the chain of this small town. And the town they were in at that point was Steinau, a smallish town that I wouldn't mind visiting. But then the father dies, and then they all become sort of poor, and the lack of funds will go with them throughout their whole lives. Basically, they have to kind of be aware of how to make money, and specifically Jacob and Wilhelm are the ones who sort of take on the burden of caring for everyone else, including the poor mother who, from what I gather in the biography, she kind of just disintegrated into depression after the father died, and she was always kind of wailing, "Oh, what am I to do?" Which, I mean, is understandable. And the person who bails them out, and he doesn't go into a lot of detail, but I do know this, and we talk about it in the class because it's kind of interesting, is the sister of the father, who is a lady in waiting for the princess of this area of Hessen Kassel, the area that they live in. So, you know, the court person who has money, some money and some influence, is able to get funds for the two older boys who have already sort of been, they realize that they're pretty smart and bookish, to go to a grammar school, so the highest level of school, a Lyceum or Gymnasium, as they say in German, in the town of Kassel, which is another beautiful town, but not very big. It's like a small town, and in the time they were there, at the beginning at least, it was sort of a replica of a Baroque sort of French type gardens, and they have a beautiful castle. This is really a cool monument there with the fountains, quite pretty, but in a sort of Enlightenment Baroque way with the architecture, but not big, not a big city. And so the sort of social habitus is interesting. It's somewhat rural, and you know, sort of watching about being connected to the folk in that way, even though they themselves were not folk, they're not peasants at all. And also not big cities, so not urbane, not sophisticated. And they kind of stay true to that. That's part of the ethos of the Grimms, is this sort of the small town family life that you kind of also get a sense of in the fairy tales sometimes. This idealization of smaller places. I mean, you don't get any big cities, and of course all fairy tales are kind of in this. In the class, I often mention it's a metaphor of the snow globe. Like there's these little kind of snow globes of the kernels of the tales that we will carry with us, and the kids like that because I think it just kind of works. And they do deliberately this creation of this idyllic world of the Grimm fairy tale, with its dark side, or the scary stuff in the tales, or the more sort of bloody stuff. So where am I in my tale here? It's already 12 minutes. So growing up, they were sort of in more rural connections, and then they go on their way, the two of them, to the grammar school and start working hard. I have a few notes here about the mother was very bookish too. She loved to read, and her favorite novel was Richardson, whose Clarissa was my favorite book last year. She loved his book called Sir Charles Grandison. And they themselves read a lot of 18th century stuff. They read a lot of kind of Gothic, like adventure novels and Robinson Crusoe and all that good stuff. That's kind of their background in terms of entertainment reading, as opposed to what they were reading for school. The background of the family was civil servants, and also sort of people who were innkeepers, and also quite a few were theologians, and they themselves were fairly strict. Their parents, at least, were strict Reformed Calvinists, and you get the ethos of Calvinism is sort of in the tales in a certain sense too. And one of the lectures I do is I do a little brief kind of connecting the ethos of the sort of be industrious, be diligent, don't be lazy, you know, the all that stuff. I connected to Max Weber, so the Protestant work ethic stuff, because this is basically Calvinism. And so in what way is this Protestant work ethic, which is sort of like part of the birth of modernity and industrialization, even sort of embedded in these idyllic fairy tales? So connecting it to, I mean, basically the whole class, I'm always trying to draw connections to modernity, to rip from the headlines type stuff, and how the fairy tales, on the one hand, they are idyllic. On the other hand, they're very kind of topical still because of the themes that they are addressing, like to do with marriage choice, like how many of the fairy tales involve a woman being picked for marriage and not having any voice or agency in the matter. And of course, bad things happen. Sometimes good things happen, but a lot of times in some of the ones that these picked, bad things happen. Anyway, so stuff like that in the fairy tales themselves. And I'm trying to think what else I want to say for this first video. It's already 12 minutes. he's honing in on the fairy tales themselves. So just at the end here, I'll tell you a little bit about, and then the next episode will be more about the actual editions of the fairy tales. The first 2 volumes of them appear early on, 1812 to 1815. And I haven't even talked about the fact that their homeland was occupied by Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars, and then he gives their area to his brother Jerome, and it creates the Kingdom of Westphalia, this sort of made-up kingdom that's basically the French kind of deciding this part of Germany, that's yours, and here you are, Jerome. And what happens under that is that Jacob, they're very scholarly, they've gone, they go to another Hessian town to study, which is Marburg, and he ends up working for Jerome as his private librarian. So he kind of gets a bit of a break there during the Napoleonic, and it's a good job in terms of money, and that's what he needs is money. And I haven't even talked about the fact that Wilhelm was very sickly and had quite serious health issues throughout his life. So he was always sort of in this bit in the shadow of Jacob just for that reason. But he was also the more normal in terms of being sociable and outgoing. Jacob is really, he reminds me of Immanuel Kant in his love of work and his love of his research and his love of what his mind is doing, you know, telling him to do, and nothing else, really. I mean, not much else. He still likes to be with his friends and family, and he loves Wilhelm. They're very close, and they kind of decide to be a team. But he's wedded to his work, you know, in this kind of way that not many people are. And so I think, yeah, so the first 2 volumes appear 1812 to 1815, and they don't do that well yet. And I'll think in the next video, just to not make these too long, I'll talk about the unique, what they're trying to do with the fairy tales, what they were trying to do, and what happened with the fairy tales, because they go into many different, they sort of take off slowly after some years. And the one that we all read today, most people, if you get a, you know, decent copy of them, is, I think it's the 6th or 7th edition, 1857. So much later on. And those tales are really quite different from what we're dealing with in the beginning. And I'll talk about where they got the tales from, which is also very interesting and different from what people think, in my next video, because this is already 17 minutes long. I hope it's somewhat interesting. It's pretty niche, I know. Let me know if you have any questions. And yeah, they're a fascinating thing, sort of, to people to read about. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.